Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for coming to hear us today. I'm going to start my presentation with, you've probably seen some of these slides before, but just to remind ourselves that we're in a difficult position this year with much lower yields and still input costs are quite high, largely down to the weather. If you look at the last June sunshine, it was exceptionally good, that lovely bright yellow colour. This year was pretty dull in June and pretty miserable. And then the little tiny picture there shows you July, which again didn't really do much to help us catch up. So yield and quality were quite badly affected. Just thank goodness you weren't in France or Germany or parts of Poland, because they had it 10 times worse, possibly some of them even worse than we had it in 2012. So we got away with it fairly lightly, although it was not a particularly good year this year. And this has sort of resulted in a downtick in crop yields for 2016, according to DEFRA's estimates, which fortunately tie in quite well with the NFU estimates as well. So well done, DEFRA. But the impact of that, which I wanted to talk very briefly about, is the effect on farmers' margins. Because of the fact the price hasn't gone up much since 2014, costs have probably not come down much at all, have gone up if anything in some cases. But the yield has really had quite a serious impact on profitability, net profit on farms in average across England. And you can do the calculations yourselves, but the ones I've come up with, it looks like it's about £178 a tonne to grow wheat at the moment, which is quite a serious position to be in. And that isn't going to be made up for by the basic payment, which will only be about £20 a tonne on that sort of level of yield. So the big decrease in yield is having quite a severe impact on profitability this year. It's often said that spring barley is a cheap crop to grow. Problem is it doesn't have much output. So again, unless you restructure your business, it's going to cost you even more per tonne to grow if you think about it in terms of your net costs. You've still got to pay the rent, you've still got to pay for the machinery, labour. So it's quite important to think about the impact of growing spring crops to overcome grass weed problems or whatever else is on the farm. You need to be thinking about how do you organise the business to make that pay. Slightly brighter for oilseed rape, not just because of the colour of the slide, where it loses slightly less money than wheat. However, the risks are quite high in growing it, and we've been really struggling with flea beetle and then the dry weather this year in large parts of the east of the country, keep in front of the crop, and so we've had tens of thousands of hectares of crop that have disappeared this autumn because they just can't keep up with the pressures on it, I think made much worse by insect pests. So, and this, going in a little bit, we've got the sort of theme of Brexit that Andrew's identified earlier. The first column there, the grey bit, which should be fairly visible even from the back, shows you how important to a farmer's net income the single payment scheme has been. So this is information we put out before the Brexit vote in June, just reminding us that actually it's very important to have a supported agriculture. Unless we could find a way to massively increase output and lower the costs, we're going to be, as things stand, currently reliant on single payment for the next few years. Talking about the NFU's post-Brexit asks, we spent the summer consulting with our members. We saw thousands and thousands of members. We had responses written into us by thousands of members. The thing that came out of that in a sort of an overview was that most of our members felt that trade and labour were the most important issues that had to be got right first, along with research funding to keep competitive and to solve some of the farmers' problems, and also the way that technology is regulated. Now, out of that, we can talk about the single payment, which I was mentioning a bit earlier, and agricultural policy, but I think the membership believe that if you get trade and labour and regulation right, then you're in a better place to ask for what kind of agricultural policy you want, what level of support, what type of mechanisms you want put in place to protect agriculture. So if we were to come out with the detail on that now, I think it would be too soon, and we'd take our mind off the really sort of important issues for the moment. So I go back to here, and what the NFU has been working on since the end of the consultation in response to the members is working on a value chain response, and hopefully you'll see some more of that later this week, where we're getting the manufacturers and the brands and the food industry to work together with us, unlike episodes perhaps in the past, so that we can have a single message to put to government that they will take the value of the food and agriculture industry seriously. It's worth £108 billion, which is far more than aviation and motor manufacture put together. that's the only way we'll get the government to listen, I think, is to show them how important agriculture is. And we've got probably nearly half of that value already signed up to a joint letter with the NFU that we're going to put into the Prime Minister later this week. And then, as I say, we'll hopefully get some broadcast coverage on the BBC and in some of the newspapers later on. But I am conscious that we haven't been able to say as much as we would like to our members and in public recently, but that's going to change. And just to give you an idea of how agricultural support fits in, don't worry about the detail of the chart, except that it's important that there's a group of countries at the top here. That laser pointer is a bit. There's a group of countries at the top of the chart there, like Norway and Japan, that pay very, very high subsidies to their farmers. And the rest of the world, Europe is at the top level of that second tier of support payments, along with China and some other parts of the world. So we're at the higher level of most of the world, but it's not abnormal levels of support, definitely. And then you've got Australia and New Zealand right at the bottom, but they still do pay some support to their farming industries. And the US and Canada in the middle, and Brazil slightly lower than that. So the point being, it's normal to have agricultural support of some sort in a modern Western economy. So we need to remind the government of that as well. It's quite important. But switching now to crop protection. We need to be talking more about the good work that farmers are doing. The NFU is also focusing a lot at the moment on coming up with the good news stories about what our members are doing, what farming is doing, what agriculture and the support industry is doing with farmers. We need to be talking more about the good that happens on farms to make sure that the public understand that farmers aren't out there doing what all the NGOs say you're doing. You're actually out there doing a great deal of good for our countryside, as well as producing the food that the manufacturers will talk to us about later this week. There are some quite important areas of legislation we need to look at in the framework of Brexit. Water regulation has caused quite a lot of difficulties in the past. We do need to keep pesticides out of water, but then you could argue perhaps that some of the legislation is quite draconian and is causing all sorts of unnecessary problems, probably focusing attention in the wrong places. So that's an area we need to look at in the near future. We need to talk about the stewardship and be aware of it. We need to make sure that we don't let these problems become water contaminants, these pesticides become water contaminants, and we're fully aware of the range of measures that are in place to help you understand how to keep the product in the field and out of water. So please make sure you're aware of these programs and are using them to help you stay on the right side of the law and in the minds of the public as well. We're already starting to talk to our regulators about what might happen in a post-Brexit situation. Clearly there's opportunity there within regulation to try and change the way it works. So there's actually much more brought back into the realms of science, and if there is politics involved, that's at least balanced with the evidence. There are some good things about the current EU pesticide registration system. It actually works quite well, except for one or two key points which we would like to see removed. And they focus around the fact that they've moved away from the risk-based system to worrying about hazard, which is very unhelpful from our point of view because it doesn't take into account how pesticides are used. So really it's keeping the best bits of the legislation but removing the bad bits. And we have to keep working with our European counterparts in the short and medium term, because until the day we leave Europe, then we're under that regulation. And wherever we get to, on the day we leave Europe, is where we'll start with our own government on what kind of regulatory system we have. So it's very important that we keep talking to our regulators and helping them understand what we think is useful and what's not. If we want to trade, our members pointed out to us that trade was their key concern in the Brexit consultation. If we want to trade into Europe, we don't have to have all their pesticide rules, but we do have to comply with maximum residue limits, which is fair enough because every other country in the world that wants to trade with the EU also has to deal with maximum residue limits. So if the EU banned glyphosate, for example, that wouldn't mean that the UK had to if we weren't within Europe. That wouldn't mean Americans had to ban it, or a Canadian or a Brazilian farmer either. What we just do make sure is that the residues that are on the crop didn't exceed European limits, and if the European limits were too low, you'd have every opportunity to go and complain about them and potentially even take them to a WTO panel. So there is a better mechanism for residue levels than there is for the actual registration and use of products. Sorry, going back to the Water Framework Directive again, that's an area we think could be used. And looking at it, just a reminder, we do think the legislation's there for a good reason, but there are areas we think need to be resolved before we go on any further. and perhaps we can use agricultural support payments in a more intelligent way to help the farmers that are doing good work and to sort of cover off some of the cost of that. But we can't really see agriculture environment programs paying the same way the basic payment scheme does at the moment, because they generally either have to be income foregone or cost, and neither of them are going to be very profitable for you. So we can't really tie into the National Trust and some others' view that you should just have agri-environment payments and that'll keep you in business, because it won't. And it would be illegal under WTO rules if you try to increase them. I just want to move quickly on to something that Andrew alluded to earlier, which is pressure and public opinion. We've already got some NGOs subverting Syngenta's advertising, turning their great rice advert into something that is very different. There's a suggestion constantly that the Commission or government officials are being paid by pesticide manufacturers, because that's an easy, misleading pitch for NGOs to tell. And then they also like to paint the farmer as being a sort of unaware participant in this, just doing whatever the pesticide manufacturer and regulator tells them. I'm presuming that the neonicotinoids and bee episodes from NGOs must be very profitable for them, judging by the amount of effort and publicity they give them, because we see them riding up the rankings in Soil Association or the Friends of the Earth's campaigning list, nearly always in the top 2 or 3. And then we've had of ours saying that they, which is a European or global, if you like, petition organisation, saying that their most successful ever campaign was millions of signatures against glyphosate. So we need to find something that will counter this and make the government and regulators realise that just because some NGOs think an issue is important doesn't mean the public necessarily believe them or subscribe to their views. An interesting summary, I thought, was from the German farming union leader. As NFU, we're usually a bit frustrated with our French and German counterparts, that they're not as vocal as we are on crop protection or nitrates or some other issues that their governments don't like them talking about. But he came up with this quite succinct phrase, saying really that it's not volatility in the markets or volatility in the weather that's the biggest threat to us in Europe. It's the way that the public talks about agriculture, which I thought was quite encouraging, that they do take it seriously. They've just got problems in Germany and France that their governments are so unwilling to listen to them that it's not even worth starting the argument with them. But where do the public get their information from? What influences them? Well, it's people like you. It's people like in this audience. The members of the public have a great opportunity to have some say in convincing politicians that there is another side to the argument, and that you do have an opportunity there to influence them, be present and be visible in those arguments. That's my message. Just quickly whipping through this. I won't go into the detail of this, but there are quite a lot of active ingredients that are coming up for re-registration soon. Some of them will be calling on you. NFU will be calling on members and agronomists and others to get active and get talking about them, because without that public presence, we risk losing quite a lot of products quite soon. And there's an example of what we did in the summer. We did an infographic to help farmers just get into the conversation about how to protect glyphosate. So there's an example of what we did last summer, but we want to make that a little bit more user-friendly and more public-facing, so that you have that opportunity to engage those conversations and make a difference there. Thank you.